Now without further ado, and ranked in no particular order, let's take a look at 10 interesting facts about Paulo Costa. 10. He began training in Muay Thai at the age of 9. Like many kids growing up in Brazil during the late 90s, Costa suffered a rough childhood and got into more than his fair share of physical confrontations. Unfortunately, the middleweight title contender once had 20 kids waiting for him after a day at school, all of whom had violent intentions. Luckily, Costa was able to avoid the group and the beating that they were no doubt looking to inflict. Given that he had already been exposed to a great deal of violence, Costa's mother was reluctant to let the 9-year-old begin Muay Thai training. However, she soon discovered the discipline and self-control associated with martial arts, and as a result agreed to let him train. Once he began focusing on Muay Thai, Costa was able to refocus his energy towards training as opposed to fighting on the streets. 9. He has previously worked in real estate and as an IT teacher. Given his imposing appearance, one might expect to find Paulo Costa's pre-UFC resume full of jobs like being a bodyguard or bouncer. That said, the middleweight standout's previous occupations weren't the least bit physical in nature. Prior to his MMA career, he worked within real estate and enjoyed some success selling properties to his friends and family. Costa even credits his time in real estate with helping him to improve with his public speaking. On top of this, Costa is also pretty tech savvy and has even worked as an IT teacher. As an instructor, the Brazilian taught folks how to utilize popular Microsoft programs like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint.
PowerPoint.
While he may have enjoyed teaching, it became a difficult gig to balance with his MMA training. However, thanks to a little financial aid from his mother, Costa was able to give up his teaching duties and focus on becoming a full-time mixed martial artist. 8. He participated in the 3rd season of The Ultimate Fighter Brazil. North American fans in particular may not be aware that Paulo Costa was actually a contestant on the 3rd season of The Ultimate Fighter Brazil, which took place back in 2014. In fact, the coaches for Season 3 were none other than Vanderlei Silva and Chael Sonnen. During the show, Costa would end up being the 2nd middleweight selected by Vanderlei Silva. Unfortunately, he would end up losing his 2nd fight on the show. However, since the fight was considered an exhibition bout, the loss didn't count towards his professional record. After his appearance on the show, Costa would go on to become the Jungle Fight champion and eventually sign with the UFC, where he would officially debut in 2017. 7. He currently holds the record for the most strikes landed per minute in the UFC. Paulo Costa is a fighter who is known for his aggressive style and impressive striking outputs. In fact, rather remarkably, he is currently averaging over 8 strikes landed per minute, which at the moment is a UFC record. Of course, volume striking isn't the only area in which Costa excels, also having the 3rd highest significant strike accuracy in middleweight history, which currently sits at 57.8%. Moreover, the middleweight slugger also currently holds the highest knockdown average amongst active UFC middleweights, with his current knockdown average at around 1.65 per fight. 6. He's one of the most drug-tested fighters on the UFC roster. Striking isn't the only area in which Paulo Costa is setting records. The Brazilian power puncher made headlines last year as he became the most tested male UFC fighter in 2019 by the United States Anti-Doping Agency. Over the previous calendar year, Costa took a grand total of 14 blood and urine tests. Fortunately, he managed to pass all 14. As for female fighters, fellow Brazilian Claudia Gardella was the most tested woman on the roster, tying with Costa with 14 tests taken. In the past, fighters like Derek Brunson and even professional surfers like Kelly Slater have suggested that the Ultra Jack Costa is using performance-enhancing drugs. And while he's never tested positive for PEDs, the Eraser has been suspended by USADA, which we will get into in a moment. 5. He cuts significant weight to make the middleweight limit. By merely glancing in his direction, it soon becomes abundantly clear that Costa is quite large for a UFC middleweight. Of course, it isn't unusual for fighters to walk around much heavier than the weight in which they ultimately compete. That said, Costa cuts a ton of body mass before his fights, even by MMA standards. Prior to his fights, he reportedly drops between 50 and 55 pounds to make the middleweight limits. For those doing the math at home, the middleweight limit in UFC is 185 pounds, which means Costa tips the scales at around 240 when he isn't training. As the 29-year-old continues to age, the drop to middleweight will likely become an increasing challenge. In other words, there's a very good chance that we may see Paulo Costa competing at light heavyweight or even heavyweight at some point down the road. 4. He received a 6-month suspension for using an IV. As was alluded to earlier, Paulo Costa received a 6-month suspension from USADA for an incident involving the use of an IV. Before we go any further, it's worth noting that the substances that were used in the IV are not banned. That said, the amounts injected prior to his UFC 212 and 217 bouts exceeded the limits allowed by the World Anti-Doping Agency. As a result, Paulo Costa received a 6-month suspension. Since the punishment was retroactive, the soon-to-be UFC 253 headliner wasn't forced to miss any time out and could return to action immediately. His older brother Carlos, who happened to administer the IV, was also suspended from working as an athlete support personnel. While the two brothers were initially looking at a 2-year suspension, the sentence was ultimately reduced due to the fact that both of them provided what was considered to be substantial assistance with the investigation. 3. Only one of his fights has gone to a decision. Costa's reputation as a finisher is both well-deserved and statistically supported. Up until his most recent fight with Yair Romero, a contest he won via a unanimous decision, Costa had finished all 12 of his previous opponents. During his first 5 years as a fighter, Costa put away his first 9 professional opponents in a single round, a stint that included 8 TKO victories and 1 submission win. In fact, it wasn't until UFC 212 that an opponent actually managed to make it out of round 1. Of course, Costa would end up winning that contest too via a TKO early into the 2nd round. Since turning pro in 2012, the 29-year-old has knocked out 11 of his 13 opponents. 2. He's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Given that he's finished so many opponents with his fists, Paulo Costa's ground game is often overlooked. While he may be best known for possessing fight-ending knockout power, the Brazilian contender is no slouch in the grappling department. As a teenager, Paulo Costa began training jiu-jitsu with his brother Carlos. And while clearly gifted on the mat, Paulo would end up temporarily quitting jiu-jitsu at the age of 17, following the unfortunate death of his father. However, his hiatus only turned out to be temporary, and 2 years later, Costa returned to the mat and would eventually go on to earn his black belt. Interestingly enough, the soon-to-be UFC title challenger has even grappled with celebrities like Ashton Kutcher. 1. He changed his name from Borrachinha to the Eraser.